not a symposium online unless something weird happens.
It just jumped back.
Okay, you know what? I'll just ignore my notes. There we go. Yeah, so anyway, so Control was made in, published in 2019 by Remedy Entertainment, and it centers on the character of Jesse Faden, who through a series of otherworldly and paranatural events becomes the director of the Federal Bureau of Control, which is in the game's world a branch of the government of the United States that is specifically investigating paranatural activities in all forms. When she becomes the director of this Federal Bureau of Control, she is directed to eliminate the Hiss, which is an evil resonance that takes over the oldest house in which the game occurs, kind of infecting human bodies and also human-made objects within the game. And we also have Jesse guided by some paranatural entity called Polaris, which is heavily hinted to be a resonance similar to the Hiss, but which is slightly different. And so we have several resonances within the game, and I kind of want to explore this concept of resonance and how it relates to ideas and theories of mediation. So what I'm relating this to is an article I read through last semester, as well as kind of building off some other work in OOT. So the theory that I'm going to be talking about today is posthuman relationism. I'm not particularly gung-ho about the term, but more about the ideas behind it. So Norah Campbell, Stephen Dunne, and Paul Ennis kind of develop and explain this term in their response to a book by Harman, which is called Materialisms, which was published in 2017. And within this article, they argue that in order to apply ideas about speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, or other new materialisms, in order to apply it to social theory, basically they're arguing it's potentially impossible to know what objects are outside of the social, outside of human perception. And so they're arguing against certain strands of arguments within these theories like OOT and speculative realism that posit what objects do before human perception comes in. And they're really emphasizing here that objects come about into the social. And so, like I mentioned, they build on Harman's OOT, and in materialisms, Harman actually coins the term object-oriented social theory, but Campbell et al. Are really arguing that when Harman talks about this social theory, he's more so talking about objects within themselves rather than, quote, the association between things, right? He's more concerned about objects, how they exist and how they develop into something that can be socially recognized. What posthuman relationism is saying is that basically we can't really know what they do before they are socially recognized or perceived by humans. And so they contend that relations between humans and non-humans in kind of all forms, specifically in objects, but also basically anything essentially non-human, these relations between them, the perceptions of them are fundamentally unstable, shifting, and possible to like codify into something that's like ontologically stable in a way in which we can perceive them in some way, or define them in some way as stable before human perception. And so taking this theory to some of the resonances within the game, like I mentioned before, we have the Hiss, which is kind of this evil entity, if we want to call it that, evil in the human perception of the word, but we don't really know what the entity's intentions are. But the Hiss is an infection. It invades human bodies. It possesses them. There's very creepy parts where they're like floating up in the sky and like chanting something. And you see them all throughout. And the Hiss also possesses specific paranatural objects, which we'll get to in a second. We also have Polaris as a resonance who offers guidance for Jesse, who leads them through the house. And like I mentioned, the Hiss also resonate with or infect or possess specific items called objects of power and altered items. I'll briefly explain what objects of power are. I know for those of you who have been attending that Merlin also went through this a little bit, but I'll give a brief recap. So objects of power, as they are defined in the game, they're defined as quote unquote archetypal objects. which are imbued with paranatural powers. So these are things like a jukebox, a TV set, an X-ray machine, a telephone, right? These kind of archetypal objects that are like basically fundamentally perceived by a large community as like something that has a particular use, that has a particular function. And these objects of power have been kind of imbued with paranatural powers somehow. Again, the process for how these particular objects get imbued with paranatural powers is not exactly known by either the player or by the people within the game. But for some reason, there are very specific objects like one telephone, one gun, one jukebox that have been imbued with paranatural powers because they are socially perceived as like archetypal objects, media objects. And so throughout the game, these are kind of possessed by the hiss in order to take advantage of their powers. And Jessie performs a ceremony, which is called like binding them. She binds them to cleanse them of the hiss and then to receive their special powers. So again, like I mentioned, these objects of power, mostly media objects. None of them are objects that exist a priori of human intervention. These are all objects that have been developed and made by humans, and often they're mostly media objects. Another example is a floppy disk, for example. And part of why I see posthuman relationism and resonance kind of reflecting here is because these objects of power, the special powers that they are imbued with, that they resonate with, come about because of their attachment to a specific social meaning or understanding of what these objects do, what they do. I'll go into a few specific details of a few specific objects in a second. But what part of my argument is that control here is trying to represent how through this kind of metaphor of these paranatural powers, they're trying to show how objects become imbued with specific social meanings over long periods of time through kind of this archetypal, this vast social like exposure to them, right? And circulated understandings of what they mean. So in order to relate this to posthuman relationism, what I'm talking about here is specifically that these objects have been made by human beings, right? So it's not like they just are a rock, right? They have been made by human beings. They've been toyed with, right? There are materials within them that have been toyed with. But then after humans have like made them, right, quote unquote, made them, the social meanings of those objects also start to affect them as well. And that's kind of relating to the posthuman relationism idea, where in order to fully understand an object, to understand the floppy disk, right, we can look at the materials, but fundamentally, these are also social objects, right? They have social meanings, and therefore, to fully understand an object, we need to understand also the social connotations behind them. So a couple of examples of these. The first one is the hotline in the game. It is a red telephone. And what the hotline allows Jessie to do is basically, again, it's not particularly well defined, but either she communicates with the dead or across space-time, across universes, again, not very sure, but she uses the hotline to communicate with entities that are no longer living within the world of the game. So for example, here's a scene from the game where the previous director of the Federal Bureau of Control kind of shows up through the hotline, right? This red light behind him appears and we see his shadow. And we can tell that he's like trying to communicate with Jessie through this hotline. And so again here, the resonance of the idea of the telephone as a communication device becomes part of the power it holds, right? It meaningfully allows her to communicate across space-time because we use phones to communicate across space-time, and then the paranatural entity of the hiss tries to possess it, Jessie cleanses it and gains that ability. Another example that is also very interesting is the service weapon. So this is basically the gun that Jessie uses to attack entities, either the hiss or other paranatural entities within the game. And what's specifically interesting about the service weapon here is specifically how it is materially constructed, and how that construction of the gun relates to this idea of resonance. So the gun has several different basically kinds of ways you can use it. There's different forms of the gun. And really only the first form, which is the one all the way on the left here, is like a solid, what we would typically think of as like a normal gun, right? It's a solid piece of metal that is like soldered together that allows someone to shoot a bullet at something. All of the other forms of the gun are literally resonant in that like there are the metal of them rearranged into different units, and they're kind of held together by this resonant power, right? Either we can call it electromagnetism, it's never really explained to us, right? But all of these objects are kind of held together to reform this gun into a new role, a new purpose. Of course, again, it's all about the social idea of a gun as an attacking object, right? She uses it to attack other entities, but it's able to kind of reform itself, recapitulate itself through the game as well. We have a couple of other examples here, like the safe, for example, is another object that Jessie can cleanse. The safe here, once she cleanses it, she gains the power of defense. So again, the social idea of the safe as something that can defend against robbers or thieves, but also the materially dense material of a safe here. The materiality of that is translated into this social understanding of defense, which then imbues the object with this supernatural power, which then Jessie can take as the player. And finally, the one I find most interesting is the Bentekoff TV. This is one of the objects that the Hiss takes over. And the Bentekoff TV here, once Jessie kind of defeats the Hiss who have possessed it and have taken it over, it allows her to fly and float as if she was, floating along the airwaves of a television set, right? Again, that's something that's never explicitly stated in the game, but as a social meaning of understanding how a TV with an antenna works, right, of understanding what the airwaves are, cleansing this object gives her the ability to fly, right? So we see a clear connection between the social understandings of these objects and the powers that they are given to the player. And pointing to the impossibility of knowing, right? Because part of posthuman relationism is not only that objects have like these social resonances, that objects come into being, into human perception because of the social, but they also point out that we fundamentally cannot know the object a priori of the social. And this is reflected in some of the descriptions of these objects within the game. So you can find specific documents within the game that can tell you about these objects. And so it'll, for example, here's the Bentekoff TV file, and it'll say basically like where this object was found, like where randomly this object suddenly started having powers, right? And it'll point to case numbers, and it'll give some background information about the object. And here, as we can see, this is kind of echoing a government document, and that there are certain lines that are crossed out, right? There are certain things that have been kind of strucken from the record. But so we could just see it as kind of representative of like government secrecy, right? But I think it also points to how these objects, we're not really exactly sure how these powers have developed, right? It's kind of that reflection of the impossibility of knowing a mediated object, fully, a priori of human knowledge. Same thing with a slide projector here.
We're at time here. There.
Okay. I'm finishing right now. So again, like I mentioned before, right, I kind of see the resonances here as the impossibility of knowing the object before social, right? The term resonance itself means both that like something is emitting a sound and something is also attuned to it or kind of receiving that sound. And so I've been trying to think, this is kind of the first step in a long process of thinking about this game as a visual and oral metaphor of resonance for objects coming into the social. And like Merlin was saying previously, the object before the social as something eerie, spooky, and resonant is something that's really interesting to me, and I hope to explore more. So thank you.